So good to see everyone. Welcome to our, number sixth round in our sustaining practices for perilous times. It has been a wonderful series of conversations from wise and interesting folks coming from a wide range of traditions, here to share with us the practices that are sustaining them right now. It is delightful to see your faces and to be together in the midst of, for all of us who are, planning to start new semesters, all of us who are making decisions about schooling, all of us who are present to folks in hospital contexts. They do indeed feel like complicated and perilous times. And we are delighted to have Maurice Charles with us today, Dean of Rockefeller Chapel at the University of Chicago. And I think that's enough from me. Oh, nope, sponsorships. This is hosted simultaneously by the Bucknell University Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, Vassar Office of Religious Life, Religious and Spiritual Life and Contemplative Practices, as well as our professional association, Axel, of college and university chaplains, and finally by the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. And we are thankful and appreciative of all of those folks. The videos will be accessible through Bucknell Religious Life Facebook page. So if you feel inspired to share or look backward or forward in our series, feel free to do that. And with that, let's turn it over to Maurice. You'll need to unmute yourself again. And thank you very much for being with us today.
And thank you, Kurt. This has been a wonderful series so far, and I'm really glad to share and to see some old colleagues. Colleagues from, well, we are old. Hi, Joanne. It's so wonderful to see all of you today, and I'm going to set my little timer here. And I'd like to take the next few moments to share something that I had never considered a spiritual practice until I had to focus on it. And I'm remembering, because there's some things that you just take for granted. Today I want to talk about remembering as a spiritual practice. And since a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I can more easily share some of my most important memories with you. Can everyone see that? Okay. Again, it's something that I take for granted. As a priest, I spend an awful lot of time, I'm an Episcopal priest, I spend an awful lot of time retelling stories. Retelling stories in the context of preaching, in the context of praying. Our most central ritual has the words, whenever you do this in memory of me. Whenever we participate in the Rite of Baptism, which is a Christian initiation ceremony involving water, we say a blessing over the water. We thank you, God, for the gift of water. And we talk about the children of Israel being led to dry land and so on. So it's part of what I do as a priest. And I'm also a historian. And I spend a lot of time remembering the European Reformations. But as an ordinary garden variety, happy to be nappy human being, who is muddling through these interesting times just like the rest of you with all sorts of ups and downs, I have had to rely on the practice of memory in order to sustain myself spiritually. Let me see if I can expand this here. There we go. This beautiful image was the very last thing that I saw on March 20th, 2020, when I was leaving the chapel. This is the inside of Rockefeller Chapel, and this is the organ loft over the back door. And I was leaving the chapel to lock it up for, it seems like the last time. It almost feels permanent because this was March 20th, and the chapel has been closed to the public since then. It was a surprisingly emotional moment for me. There was someone in the chapel lone person wearing a mask, which looked very strange to me at the time. Now it's commonplace. Sitting there alone, foreshadowing what we were going to face once I walked through those doors. And because it was such an emotional moment, I picked up the Psalms as I was walking to the back door, and I read Psalm 90, as I had done many times with my minister father, as we used to lead funerals together. And it was in that old King James Version English: Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hadst formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. And those were the last words that I said in the chapel as I looked up and I saw the state trumpets that I would not hear for a long time, the warm tones of the organ, the choir, all of those wonderful things I came back to Chicago for that would soon fall silent. And as I walked through those doors and I locked those doors, and again, it was far more painful than I thought it was going to be. And the memory of being in the chapel leading services really started to fade. Because even though I've known this chapel for 30 years, I've only been the dean for 1 year, less than a full academic year. And as that memory started to fade, as it could no longer sustain me, and even more so, as I could no longer offer it to sustain other people because of this pandemic, as all of that was being stripped away, the beautiful English oak, the warmth of the organ, the sound of the choir, the sound of the readings, I found that what I was left with, my memories. And specifically what I remembered was the ancestral memory of my ancestors, and especially the ancestral memory that is connected to my own baptism. I was baptized in a tradition on the profession of my faith, which means I remember my baptism when I was a small, precocious boy. I remember being dunked in the water and being pulled out of the water as a sign that the old me was dying somehow and the new me was being born into a new community that would sustain me for the rest of my life. And as I could no longer hear those European classical anthems that I had gotten so accustomed to over the years in my own church and in Rockefeller Chapel, I remembered especially the sound of the spirituals that I grew up with and what it was like to be baptized, the way that my great uncle chanted when he lowered me down into the water. That was in the mid-60s. This is a film from the 30s, and it's from the archives of the University of South Carolina, the Moving Image Research Collection. This is, we believe, somewhere in Virginia. And this is what I remember, and I hope I pressed that. Church sounded like that in the 60s, even though this is the 30s. I'm going to freeze the frame here. This baptism is not happening in a church. You can't see all of the sign, but this sign says, "Remember this park, built exclusively for the colored race. Welcome." This was an example of some of the folks that I can count as my ancestors making a safe space during a time when the beaches were segregated, where there was no space and there was no safety, practicing their faith in perilous times. Now, I was not, of course, baptized in the 30s. It was the 60s. In this little church in Cleveland, Ohio. It's one of two that my great uncle founded. And I can remember him lowering me down in the water and my father pulling me out of the water because I started to squirm around. I have great memories of my great uncle at the benediction raising his hand and saying, "Now unto the one who is able to keep us from falling, be power, glory, dominion, and majesty." And we wore our suits and we dressed up because we were in the midst of majesty. And that made us a majestic people, even in the midst of segregation and other perilous times. Perilous times like the year before during the Huff riots in the neighborhood next to us, next to where the church was. Perilous times like the year after I was baptized during the Glenville riots in the neighborhood where the church was. When I hear certain gospel songs, I can still smell smoke. It took me years to figure out why until I started to remember through the help of my relatives and reading the history of that time. We were in the presence of majesty during times of sickness. Some of you are old enough to remember. You remember the Hong Kong flu? Haven't heard that in a long time. This is the flu pandemic of 1968. One of those old images. I remember my mother talking about it at the time. "I don't want you catching the flu, and I don't want to have to visit you in the hospital under an oxygen tent." Telling my age there. Part of the reason that we could go through those perilous times is that it was a part of our own tradition to talk about how things were before, even before 1960, 1930. This is a slave cabin in, let me get the little area for you. This is in Alabama. You follow Alabama, right on the border of Alabama and Georgia. And my ancestors worked plantations in Alabama and in Georgia. And in the 60s, when I was growing up and they were talking about being people of faith, they would always talk about how it wasn't always this good, they used to say. We can remember, our ancestors were in the, enslaved on plantations in Alabama on my father's side and Georgia on my mother's side, and we used to steal away when we didn't have churches and pianos and organs, they used to always say. And we would go out into the wilderness and we would pray. And sometimes we had to hide from our captors in order to be together and to be with God. We didn't always have it this good. My relatives in Georgia were in the path of Sherman's march from Atlanta to the sea. I wasn't the only one who was baptized when the world was on fire. My people have always practiced their faith in perilous times. And as I go through this perilous time and attempt to be present to other people, I remember, and those ancestral memories keep me going. Behind me is Lake Michigan. This is the view from my bedroom, a long way from 1960s Cleveland and a long way from the cabins in Georgia and Alabama. Whenever I see a body of water, I remember my baptism. I remember that I'm standing in a liberating stream that predates me and that will be there after I'm gone. And in that water are my ancestors. And I'm never alone. I was baptized when the world was on fire. They were baptized when the world was on fire. I don't have to be heroic in this moment. I haven't done a good job of being heroic. Maybe I'll have stories that will embellish how heroic I was after the fact, but I am no hero in this moment. But this water reminds me that my job is not to be heroic. It is to stand in that liberating stream where my ancestors stood and to do my part to keep that water flowing in a loving and liberating direction. I remember, and I hope you will too.